My name is Richard Thompson, and I'm 62 years old. I've lived my entire life in Kansas City, where I work as a sales consultant. I met Linda, my wife, back in high school. She had this infectious laugh and bright blue eyes that could light up a room. We got married young, 22 years old, filled with dreams of a perfect life together. For nearly 4 decades, we built a life. Raised 2 amazing kids, Jake and Emily, who now have families of their own. Our house was a haven, filled with laughter, love, and the smell of Linda's apple pies. I worked hard, often taking on extra projects and business trips to secure our future. I never once doubted her loyalty, even when I had to be away more than I wanted to. But recently, something felt off. Linda became distant, always on her phone, and the warmth we shared seemed to be fading. I noticed things, a different scent on her, excuses that didn't quite add up. Just stress, she'd say whenever I asked. But my gut told me otherwise. One day, before I left for a week-long business trip, I decided to install hidden cameras around the house. It felt wrong, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that something was going on. It wasn't just paranoia, it was instinct. And I needed the truth. For the first couple of days, I checked the cameras obsessively from my hotel room. Nothing unusual. Linda went about her usual routines, gardening, reading, making dinner. But on the 3rd day, the cameras went offline. Just like that. No warning, no explanation. I called Linda, trying to play it cool. "Hey honey, are we having internet issues?" The cameras stopped working. There was a pause on the other end before she responded, her voice a little too calm. "Yeah, I think it's just an outage. I'll call the provider in the morning." My heart sank. I knew something was wrong, something she wasn't telling me. So I cut my trip short, packed my bags, and drove through the night, my mind racing with fear, anger, and disbelief. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was just starting to rise. The house looked peaceful, like nothing was out of place. But I knew better. As I stepped inside, I heard something, a muffled sound coming from upstairs. My stomach churned as I crept up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. I approached the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. I could hear soft moans and hushed laughter, Linda's voice, unmistakably. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly pushed the door open. And there they were. Linda was on the bed, her legs spread wide, and him, a younger man, someone I didn't recognize, was standing over her, finishing himself off onto her face. Her eyes were closed, and she had this twisted smile, as if she was enjoying every second of it. I felt sick. My stomach lurched at the sight. The woman I had loved, the woman I had shared my life with for 40 years, was lying there, degraded in the most humiliating way. I could barely breathe. The betrayal I felt in that moment was like a knife twisting in my gut. Linda opened her eyes just as the man wiped himself off with a towel. Her expression changed from pleasure to shock when she saw me standing there. She gasped, scrambling to cover herself, her face still smeared with the evidence of their infidelity. "Richard," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The man froze, his eyes wide in panic, fumbling with his clothes as if he'd been caught stealing. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just stood there, feeling this sickening mix of rage and disgust boiling inside me. "What the hell is this?" My voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. The man, he couldn't have been more than 30, didn't say a word. He pulled his pants up, his shirt half-buttoned, and darted past me, leaving without a backward glance. Linda, still on the bed, was crying now. "Richard, please, it's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly. "Not what it looks like? I just saw everything." She tried to stand up, to come to me, but I took a step back. "Don't touch me," I warned, my hands trembling with anger. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. The woman I had devoted my life to was standing there, covered in another man's filth, trying to act like it was all some kind of mistake. "I'm sorry, Richard. I didn't mean for it to happen." She was sobbing now, desperate, but I couldn't even look at her. "Didn't mean for it to happen? How long, Linda? How long have you been doing this behind my back?" My voice was shaking, the fury barely contained. She didn't answer, just stood there, her tears streaming down her face. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. I wanted to scream, to break something, but all I could do was stare at her, disgusted by the sight of the woman I once loved. "I've worked my entire life for us, for our future, and this is what you do?" My hands clenched into fists as I stepped closer. "You throw it all away for this?" I gestured to the bed, still rumpled from their sordid act. "I was lonely," she whispered, but I cut her off. "Lonely?" I spat, the venom in my voice surprising even me. "You weren't lonely. You were bored. You were selfish." I turned and grabbed my suitcase from the closet, shoving clothes inside with trembling hands. "Where are you going?" she sobbed, standing there helplessly. "I don't know." "But I'm not staying here," I said, my voice cold. "Not with you. Not after this." I could hear her crying as I walked out the door, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could think about was the humiliation, the betrayal, and how I was going to make her pay for every second of it. I drove aimlessly, my mind clouded with images I wished I could erase. Linda's laughter, that man, what they were doing together. The rage burned deep inside, but there was something else too, an ache that felt like my heart had been torn out of my chest. I couldn't wrap my head around it. 40 years together, and it had all come crashing down in an instant. How could she do this to me? I kept driving, the sun starting to rise behind me as I left the town far behind. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the barren landscape mirroring the emptiness I felt inside. The phone buzzed in the passenger seat, more messages, more calls, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I couldn't even think about talking to her. As I sped down the highway, something happened. The car lurched, and I heard the unmistakable thump of a blown tire. Of course, I thought bitterly. One more thing to go wrong. I pulled off to the side of the road, the car groaning as it came to a halt. I slammed the door behind me and walked to the back of the car, cursing under my breath. The last thing I needed right now was to change a damn tire on the side of the road, but there was no one else to do it. No one else to lean on. Not anymore. The tire was completely shredded, and as I opened the trunk to retrieve the spare, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. Physically, emotionally, I was drained. The highway was quiet, save for the occasional car whizzing by on the opposite side. I crouched down and began loosening the bolts, my hands trembling with a mix of fatigue and fury. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. As I struggled to get the tire off, a car slowed down on the opposite side of the road. I heard the faint sound of a horn, and when I looked up, I saw an older woman behind the wheel, pulling over onto the shoulder. She must have been in her late 40s, maybe early 45s, with grey hair tied back in a neat bun. Her car was old, a little beat up, but it seemed reliable. She crossed the road carefully, waving as she approached. "Need some help, hun?" she asked, her voice warm and full of concern. I shook my head at first. "No, I'm fine," I muttered, my pride getting the best of me. But the truth was, I wasn't fine. I felt like I was falling apart. She ignored my protest and came closer, bending down to look at the flat tire. "Looks like you've had a rough morning," she said with a kind smile. "Let me give you a hand. I've changed more of these than I'd like to admit." Before I could argue, she was helping me lift the spare tire out of the trunk. I was too tired to fight it, so I just let her. "You from around here?" she asked casually as we worked. "Kansas City," I replied, keeping my eyes on the bolts. She nodded. What brings you all the way out here? For a moment, I thought about brushing off the question, giving her some vague answer. But something about the way she looked at me, those kind, understanding eyes, made it impossible to hold back. The words started spilling out, and before I knew it, I was telling her everything. My wife, I began, my voice shaky. She's been cheating on me. I caught her with some guy, in our own bed. The bitterness in my throat made it hard to talk, but once I started, I couldn't stop. 40 years. We've been together for 40 years. I thought we were happy. I thought, my voice trailed off, and I had to take a deep breath to keep from breaking down right there on the side of the road. The woman looked at me, her eyes full of sympathy. I'm so sorry, hun, she said softly, resting a hand on my shoulder. That's a heavy burden to carry. I nodded, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I don't know what to do. I can't even look at her, but the thought of leaving her, after all these years, my voice broke, and I wiped at my eyes, embarrassed by the tears that had started to fall. She didn't judge. Didn't rush me. She just listened, really listened, in a way I hadn't been listened to in a long time. It felt like a weight was slowly being lifted from my chest as I poured out everything. The betrayal, the anger, the sadness that sat like a stone in my gut. I don't even know who she is anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. How can you love someone for so long, and then find out they are not who you thought they were? She let out a heavy sigh, looking off into the distance for a moment. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs, she said gently. Sometimes people change in ways we can't understand. But that doesn't mean you deserve this. You gave your heart, and she broke it. That's not on you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but in a good way. They were true. I had given everything to Linda, and she had shattered it all without a second thought. You know, she continued, her voice soft, I lost my husband a few years back. We had our ups and downs, but we stuck it out. He wasn't perfect, but he never betrayed me like that. You've got to think about what's best for you now. You can't let her tear you down any more than she already has. For the first time since I caught Linda, I felt like I could breathe again. This stranger, this woman who had stopped to help me on the side of the road, had somehow managed to give me a sliver of clarity. She wasn't offering easy answers, but she was offering something better, compassion, understanding. We finished changing the tire, and she stood up, brushing off her hands. There, she said with a smile. Good as new. I straightened up, feeling a little lighter than I had before. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to stop. But I'm glad you did. She smiled warmly. Sometimes we all need a little help. Don't be too proud to accept it. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. As she walked back to her car, she turned and called out, Take care of yourself, hun, you deserve better than what she gave you. I watched her drive away, the weight in my chest easing just a little. She was right. I did deserve better. And I was going to make sure Linda paid for what she did. But for the first time since it happened, I didn't feel alone. I got back into the car, feeling a sense of resolve harden inside me. Linda thought she could get away with this, but I wasn't going to let her. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I drove back home, still shaken from everything that had happened. The encounter with that older woman had eased some of the weight on my shoulders, but the anger, the hurt, they were still there, simmering beneath the surface. I wasn't the kind of man who took betrayal lightly, and I knew I couldn't just walk away from what Linda had done. The house looked the same as always when I pulled into the driveway, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Everything about it seemed different now, tainted by the memory of what I'd seen. The place that had once been our sanctuary felt like a stranger's house. I sat in the car for a while, staring at the front door. I wasn't sure what I was going to say or do when I walked in, but I knew I had to face her. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I took a deep breath and finally stepped out. When I opened the door, I found Linda sitting at the kitchen table, her face puffy from crying. She didn't look up right away when she heard me come in, but I could tell she was bracing herself for what was about to happen. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with everything left unsaid between us. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I didn't know if you were coming back." I closed the door quietly behind me, not answering right away. I just stood there, looking at her, this woman I had shared my entire life with. She looked small, fragile, like the weight of her actions had finally crushed her. But it didn't stir any pity in me. All I could think about was how she had thrown everything away. "I came back to talk," I finally said, my voice low, almost steady. I wasn't going to explode in anger, I'd had enough time to cool down. But that didn't mean I wasn't angry. I was furious. She stood up slowly, wringing her hands together. "Richard, please. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I made a terrible mistake." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "A mistake?" I repeated, the word tasting sour in my mouth. "A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk from the store, Linda. What you did, that's something else entirely." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she wiped them away with trembling hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just... I don't know. You were always working, always away, and I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "I was working for us, Linda. I was out there trying to make sure we had a future. You think I wanted to be away from home all the time? You think I enjoyed leaving you alone? I did it because I thought we were building something together." She sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking, but I couldn't stop. The words were pouring out of me now, all the hurt and anger I'd been holding inside. "And this is what you do? You throw everything away for some fling? Some guy you probably don't even know that well?" She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, Richard. I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't plan it, it just happened." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that it didn't just happen. People don't accidentally betray the person they've spent their entire life with. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, watching her crumble. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, almost pleading now. "I love you. I do. I know I made a mess of things, but I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." I stared at her, the woman who had once meant everything to me. And yet, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. How could she stand there, telling me she loved me, after everything she'd done? "You love me?" I said, my voice quieter now, almost hollow. "How can you say that, after what I saw? After what you did?" She collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know. I don't know what's wrong with me. I was so lonely, and I made a mistake." For a moment, there was silence between us. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to walk out the door and never look back, but another part, some old, broken part, wanted to fix things. But I wasn't sure if there was anything left to fix. "I don't know if I can forgive this, Linda," I finally said, my voice quieter, almost tired. "You don't just bounce back from something like this." She looked up at me, her eyes desperate. "Please, Richard. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy, I'll stop working, whatever you want, just don't leave me." I looked at her, sitting there, a mess of guilt and tears, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered what I had seen. I remembered the feeling of betrayal, the humiliation, and it hardened me all over again. "I'm not leaving," I said, though it was harder to say than I expected. "But things are going to change. She blinked, confused. What do you mean? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. You going to give me the house? You going to sign over the savings? And then, when this is all over, you can go your way, and I'll go mine. Her face drained of color, and for the first time, she looked truly afraid. Richard, you can't mean that. We've been together for so long. We can't just. I shook my head. You made your choice, Linda. Now you have to live with it. The tears came harder now, her sobs filling the room, but I didn't have the energy to comfort her. I didn't have anything left to give. I'll have the papers ready by the end of the week, I said, turning to leave. You'll sign them, and we'll be done. I didn't look back as I walked out the door, her sobs following me into the hallway. When I got to the car, I just sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. The anger was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't just about what she had done, it was about everything we had lost. I thought about that woman on the side of the road, how she had told me I deserved better. Maybe she was right. But for now, I just needed to get through this. The drive away from the house felt strange, like I was finally untethered from something I'd been chained to for too long. I gripped the steering wheel, the road blurring a little as my thoughts raced. I had just made the final break from Linda. It wasn't the explosive end I had imagined, it was quieter, sadder, like something had just worn out. I didn't know where I was headed. The idea of going back to that cheap motel didn't sit right with me, but I wasn't ready to stay anywhere that felt like home. I needed space, time to think, to process what had just happened. So I drove. As I passed familiar places, the grocery store, the old diner where Linda and I used to eat on weekends, it hit me just how much of my life had been tied up with hers. Our entire town was a reminder of what I had just lost, what she had thrown away. It felt suffocating, but I kept driving, trying to push it all to the back of my mind. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a local park. I didn't really have a plan, I just needed to get out of the car, to clear my head. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the grass. A few kids were playing on the swings, their laughter cutting through the otherwise quiet evening. I sat down on a bench, running my hands through my hair and staring at nothing in particular. The divorce papers were sitting on the passenger seat of my car, signed, official. It was done, but it didn't feel like the victory I thought it would. It just felt hollow. The anger had been what kept me going for the last few days, but now, with the worst of it over, I felt lost. I thought about the years Linda and I had spent together, the moments that had meant everything, raising the kids, building our life, the quiet nights when it was just the two of us. All of it felt so far away now. And I couldn't figure out how we had gotten from there to here. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I hesitated before pulling it out. It was a text from Emily, a daughter. Dad, are you okay? Haven't heard from you in a few days. Call me when you can. I stared at the message for a minute, my chest tightening. She didn't know. She and Jake, a son, had no idea what had happened between their mother and me. I hadn't told them yet, partly because I didn't want to drag them into it, and partly because I wasn't ready to admit that my marriage had fallen apart. I shoved the phone back in my pocket, leaning back on the bench. I didn't know how to explain any of this to them. They loved their mom, and I couldn't bear the thought of turning their world upside down. But they had a right to know. They would need to know. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the sky as it shifted from golden to dark blue. I kept thinking about that older woman who had helped me with the flat tire. She had said something that stuck with me, you deserve better than what she gave you. But now, as I sat there alone, I wasn't so sure. Did I really deserve better? Or had I been part of the problem? I thought about all the years I had spent working, away from home, and maybe she had been right. Maybe I wasn't there enough. But still, there had to be another way. A way that didn't involve betrayal. I didn't know when I'd start to feel normal again, or if I ever would. All I knew was that things had to change. I couldn't keep going like this, drowning in the past, stuck in the betrayal. Eventually, I got up and started walking, just wandering through the park. The cool evening air helped clear my head a little, and as I walked, I started thinking about what life was going to look like now. For the first time in years, I was on my own. No Linda. No shared home. Just me. And the thought both terrified and relieved me. I needed to rebuild. Not just my life, but myself. I'd spent so long defining everything by our marriage, by our family, that I didn't even know who I was without all of that. But I was going to have to figure it out. I stopped by a small pond, watching the ducks paddle around lazily. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of calm. Maybe it wasn't all going to be okay right away, but I wasn't broken either. I could still move forward. As I stood there, I realized I hadn't really lost everything. My kids, my future, my ability to rebuild, they were still there, waiting for me. Linda's betrayal hadn't taken that away from me, even if it felt like it had in the moment. I pulled out my phone and looked at Emily's message again. She deserved the truth. Both of them did. With a deep breath, I dialed her number and listened to it ring. After a couple of seconds, I heard her voice on the other end. "Dad? Are you okay?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah, honey. I'm okay. But we need to talk." The next morning, I packed up my things from the motel. It didn't take long, just a small duffel bag with the basics. I didn't have much with me, and honestly, I didn't need much. I felt numb as I zipped up the bag, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Leaving the motel didn't make anything better, but at least I wasn't alone. Emily had been kind enough to offer me a place to stay, and I was grateful. I just wished it didn't have to be like this. The drive to her house felt longer than it actually was. I spent most of it in silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy. My mind kept circling around the same thoughts, the same questions I didn't have answers to. How had it all come to this? 40 years of marriage, gone in the blink of an eye. I wasn't sure how to move forward, or if I even could. When I pulled into Emily's driveway, she was already waiting for me on the porch. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reaches your eyes. I could tell she was worried, even if she was trying to hide it. "Hey, Dad," she said softly as I got out of the car. She walked over and hugged me, and I held on to her for a moment longer than usual. I needed that. "Hey, Em," I said, my voice sounding tired even to me. She pulled back, still smiling gently. "I'm glad you're here. Come on in, let's get you settled." I followed her inside, trying to take in the warmth of her home. It felt so different from the house I had shared with Linda. That place didn't feel like mine anymore. It was filled with too many memories, too much pain. But here, at Emily's, things felt lighter. Even if I didn't feel like myself, at least I knew I was safe. She led me to the guest room. It was small but comfortable, a neatly made bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the yard. I set my bag down and sat on the bed, feeling the weight of everything settle on my shoulders again. "You okay?" Emily asked from the doorway, watching me closely. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just tired." She walked over and sat beside me. "I know this is a lot. I can't imagine what you're going through, but I want you to know that you don't have to go through it alone. You've got me and Jake. We'll figure this out together." I sighed, nodding again. "I know. I don't even know where to start." We sat in silence for a while. I felt like I was supposed to say more, but I couldn't find the words. Emily gave my hand a squeeze before standing up. You don't have to figure it all out today, Dad. Just take your time. We're here when you're ready. Later, I knew I had to make the call to Jake. I had been putting it off, not because I didn't want to talk to him, but because I didn't know how to say it. Telling Emily had been hard enough. But Jake? Jake had always been so close to his mom. I didn't know how he'd take it. I sat outside on Emily's porch, my phone in my hand, staring at Jake's name on the screen. Finally, after a long moment, I dialed his number. Hey, Dad. Jake answered, his voice upbeat. He had no idea what was coming. What's up? Hey, Jake, I started, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to talk to you about something. Something important. I could hear the shift in his tone, the concern creeping in. What's going on? Is everything okay? I swallowed hard, not sure how to say it. No, it's not. Your mom and we're getting a divorce. There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear him trying to process the words, trying to make sense of something that didn't make any sense at all. What? He finally said, his voice quiet, confused. Why? What happened? I took a deep breath. She's been seeing someone else. I found out a few days ago. I couldn't stay, Jake. More silence. I could tell he was struggling to find something to say. I don't understand, he said after a while, his voice shaking slightly. How could she do that? After all these years? I don't understand it either, I said quietly. But it's real. I'm staying at Emily's for now. I need to see you, Jake said, his voice firmer now. I'm coming over tomorrow. You don't have to, I started, but he cut me off. No, Dad. I need to come. I need to talk to you. We hung up, and I sat there, staring out at the yard, feeling the weight of everything settle even heavier on my chest. Telling Jake had been harder than I thought it would be. I knew how much he loved his mom, how much he had looked up to her. How was he supposed to understand this? How was I supposed to explain it? The next morning, Jake pulled up in his old truck. He got out and walked straight toward me, his face a mix of confusion and anger. He hugged me tight, and I could feel the frustration and sadness in his grip. Dad, I don't know what to say, he mumbled as he pulled back. I can't believe this. I know, I said quietly. Neither can I. We went inside, and Emily joined us in the living room. The three of us sat there, the silence heavy. Jake kept shaking his head, like he was trying to make sense of something that couldn't be explained. I just don't get it, he finally said, his voice low. How could Mom do this? How could she? I don't know, Jake, I said, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. But it's happened, and we have to deal with it. Emily reached over and put her hand on my arm. We'll get through this, Dad. You're not alone. I looked at my kids, my two grown children who were now sitting beside me, helping me pick up the pieces of a life I didn't know how to rebuild. It wasn't going to be easy, but knowing they were here, that they cared, made a difference. I wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. That night, after Emily went to bed, I found myself sitting in the quiet of the guest room, staring at my phone. Linda's missed call was still there, glaring at me, reminding me of the conversation I didn't want to have but knew I needed to. I had been avoiding it, hoping the silence would make things easier, but I knew deep down it wouldn't. There were too many loose ends, too many questions still gnawing at me. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on my chest, and then dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring. Richard, she said quickly, her voice shaky and uncertain. I didn't think you'd call me back. I wasn't sure I would, I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. I could hear her breathing on the other end, that familiar sound from years of late-night talks. But this time, it felt foreign. "I'm sorry," she said, her words rushing out. "I know I've ruined everything. I don't even know what to say anymore." I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the knot of frustration and pain tightening in my chest. "There's not much you can say, Linda," I replied. "You can't undo what's already been done." "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. It got out of control. I didn't think it would hurt this much. I didn't think it would go this far." My jaw clenched as I tried to keep my anger in check. "How could you not think it would hurt?" I said, my voice colder than I intended. "What did you think would happen when I found out?" She sobbed softly, and I could picture her sitting alone in our house, the house we'd built together, feeling sorry for herself. "I was so lonely, Richard," she whispered. "You were gone so much with work. I didn't know how to handle it. And then? I made a mistake." "Lonely?" I repeated, the anger bubbling up again. "You think I wasn't lonely too? I worked long hours, I took those trips for us, to make sure we had a future. I was doing it for both of us, Linda, and while I was out there, you—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The image of her with that man, in our bed, flashed in my mind, and I felt sick all over again. The betrayal cut deeper every time I thought about it. "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, and I wish I could take it back. I never wanted to hurt you." I let out a bitter laugh. "Well, you did. You didn't just hurt me, Linda. You destroyed everything we had. 40 years, and this is what it comes to?" There was another long pause, her sobs quieting down. "I don't even recognize myself anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why I did it. I don't know what's wrong with me." I sat there, staring at the floor, trying to make sense of it all. For so many years, I had seen Linda as my partner, the woman I thought I'd grow old with. But now, I didn't recognize her either. The woman on the other end of the line wasn't the same person I'd married. Maybe she hadn't been for a while. "I don't know who you are anymore," I said quietly. "And honestly, I don't think I want to." She didn't respond right away, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of her soft breathing, the sound that used to bring me comfort but now felt like a reminder of everything we'd lost. "I don't blame you for hating me," she said after a while. "I hate myself for what I did. I wish I could go back and undo it all. But you can't," I said, my voice flat. "None of this can be undone, Linda. There's no going back." She started crying again, but this time it felt distant, like I was listening to a stranger. The hurt I had carried for so many days, that unbearable pain, was still there, but it was starting to feel different. Maybe I had reached my limit. Maybe I was just too tired to keep feeling it all. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered through her tears. "I don't know why I let it happen, but I never stopped loving you." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the impact she was hoping for. They didn't change anything. Love didn't excuse what she'd done, and I couldn't pretend that it did. "It doesn't matter anymore," I said quietly. "Love or no love, you made your choice. You crossed a line, and we can't come back from that." Her sobs grew softer, and I could feel the conversation drawing to a close. There was nothing left to say. Nothing that would change what had happened. "I'm sorry, Richard," she said one last time, her voice almost pleading. I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, trying to release the tension that had built up inside me. "I know you're sorry. But that doesn't fix it. It's over, Linda." There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that felt final. I knew she understood, even if she didn't want to. "Goodbye, Linda," I said, my voice steady now. "Goodbye," she whispered, and then I hung up. I sat there for a long time after the call ended, the phone still in my hand, staring out into the dark. There was no satisfaction in the conversation, no sense of closure or justice. But there was something else, a quiet understanding that it was truly over. That the chapter had closed, and there was no point in looking back anymore. I lay down on the bed, pulling the blanket up around me. I still didn't know what came next, how I was supposed to rebuild my life, but for the first time in days, I didn't feel so crushed by it all. The conversation hadn't healed anything, but it had helped me let go, just a little. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out the next steps. But for tonight, I allowed myself to rest, knowing that I had taken the first step toward moving forward. It wasn't a perfect end, but it was an end, and that was enough for now. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. Not better, exactly, but lighter. There was still a dull ache in my chest, but the anger and confusion that had weighed me down for days were starting to fade. The conversation with Linda had given me some clarity. This part of my life was truly over. And as painful as it was, I knew I couldn't keep holding on to something that was gone. I got up, made the bed, and headed downstairs. Emily was already in the kitchen, making coffee. She smiled when she saw me, a little brighter than yesterday, like she could sense the shift in me. "Morning, Dad," she said, pouring me a cup. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in days," I admitted, sitting down at the table. I took the coffee gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through my hands. "I talked to your mom last night." Her eyebrows shot up. "You did? How did that go?" I sighed, leaning back in the chair. "It was hard, but necessary." She apologized, cried, said all the things you'd expect. But it didn't change anything. "I think we both know it's over." Emily nodded slowly, taking in what I was saying. "Do you feel any better?" "I mean, after talking to her?" "Yeah, I think so," I said, staring into the coffee cup. "I'm still hurt, still angry, but I feel like I can finally start letting go. There's no point in holding on to all of it anymore." She sat down across from me, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "That's good, Dad. I'm glad you're starting to feel some relief. It's going to take time, but at least you're not carrying it all by yourself." I nodded, appreciating how supportive she'd been through all of this. I didn't know what I would have done without her. "I don't know where I'd be if it weren't for you and Jake." Emily smiled softly. "That's what family's for." We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our coffee. The quiet felt different now, less heavy, more like a pause before things started to move forward again. "I think I need to start figuring out what comes next," I said after a while. "I can't stay here forever." Emily shook her head. "You don't have to rush, Dad. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. There's no pressure." "I know," I replied, grateful. "But I think it's time I start putting the pieces back together. I can't live in limbo forever." She gave me an understanding nod. "If you want, I can help you start looking for a place, or maybe we can talk to Jake about options. You don't have to figure it out on your own." I thought about it for a moment. Moving forward felt daunting, but staying stuck in this limbo felt worse. "Yeah, maybe we could start looking. Nothing serious yet, but I'd like to get a sense of what's out there." Emily smiled. "We can do that." The day passed quietly, but with more purpose than before. I spent some time outside, taking a walk through the neighborhood, just letting myself breathe. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and for the first time in a while, I felt like the world wasn't pressing down on me. It was still strange to think of my life without Linda, without the house, without everything we had built together. But I also knew that dwelling on what was lost wasn't going to help me rebuild. When I got back to the house, Jake had called. I picked up the phone and dialed him back, knowing this conversation would be different than the ones we'd had before. "Hey, Dad," he answered, his voice calm. "How are you holding up?" "I'm doing okay," I said. "I talked to your mom last night." There was a pause on the other end. "Really? How'd that go?" "It went about as well as I expected. She apologized, said she regretted everything, but it didn't change much. It's over, Jake. I'm moving on." Jake let out a slow breath. "I'm glad you're finally getting some closure. It's been hard for me to wrap my head around all of this, but if you're moving forward, then I'll follow your lead." "That's all we can do now," I said. "It's not easy, but staying angry isn't going to help anyone." "You're right," Jake agreed. "I've been mad for days, but I know that's not how we should handle this. I just want to be there for you, Dad. However you need." "I know you do," I said, feeling a swell of pride for him. "And you have been. You and Emily, you've both been there when I needed it most." "We're a team," Jake said, his voice softening. "We'll get through it together." After we hung up, I sat down in the living room, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't fully healed, there was still a long road ahead, but I was starting to feel like myself again. Talking to Jake, being here with Emily, making small steps toward the future, it was all part of the process. For the first time in days, I could see a path forward. It wasn't clear yet, but it was there. I wasn't stuck anymore. I was moving. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what the next few weeks would look like. I had a lot of work ahead of me, figuring out where to live, how to rebuild my life, and what my next steps would be. But instead of dreading it, I felt a small sense of hope. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Not right away, but eventually. I closed my eyes, breathing in the quiet of the night. For the first time, I wasn't overwhelmed by what I had lost. I was thinking about what I could still build. A few weeks had passed since I moved into my small apartment. It was quiet, peaceful even. I'd fallen into a routine, morning coffee on the balcony, unpacking bit by bit, and sometimes walking around the neighborhood just to clear my mind. Emily and Jake visited often, and though they offered to help more, I was starting to feel like I could handle things on my own again. One evening, as the sun was setting, I sat out on the balcony, looking at the fading light. It had been a long road, but I was finally beginning to feel like I could breathe again. The pain of what Linda had done hadn't disappeared, but it had started to fade into something more manageable. The future didn't look quite as bleak anymore. Just as I was starting to relax, my phone buzzed beside me. I glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Emily or Jake. But my heart skipped a beat when I saw the name. Linda. I hadn't heard from her since that last call weeks ago. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but something made me open the message. It was short, but it knocked the wind out of me. "We need to talk. There's something I never told you. It's important." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. What could possibly be left to say? I thought I had heard it all, the affair, the betrayal, the apologies that meant nothing. What more could there be? My mind raced with questions, and against my better judgment, I texted back. "What is it, Linda?" I barely had time to set the phone down before it buzzed again. Her reply came fast. "There's something you don't know. I should have told you a long time ago, but I was scared. I never thought you'd find out." I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What now?" My fingers hovered over the screen as I typed. "What are you talking about?" Her next message hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just one man, Richard. There were others. "I've been unfaithful for years. I don't know why I did it, but you deserve to know the truth. I'm so sorry." I stared at the words, my hands trembling. "Years?" my chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I reread the message, hoping I had misunderstood, but it was there in black and white. It wasn't just one man. It wasn't just a mistake. It had been going on for years. My mind raced back to all those times I had been away on business, all the moments I thought I could trust her. All the while, she had been lying to me. I stood up, pacing the balcony, my heart pounding in my chest. The anger I thought I had left behind roared back with a vengeance. Everything I had been working through, all the progress I thought I'd made, suddenly felt like a joke. She hadn't just broken our marriage, she had shattered it repeatedly, over and over, behind my back. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the balcony, but I couldn't even move. I was paralyzed by the betrayal, by the realization that my entire marriage had been built on lies. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Linda. Please forgive me. I don't expect us to go back to the way things were, but I couldn't live with this secret anymore. I'm sorry for everything. I let out a bitter laugh, feeling the heat rise in my chest. Forgive her? After everything? How many lies had she told me? How many times had she betrayed me without me ever knowing? I sat back down, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I stared out at the darkening sky, trying to find some kind of peace, but it was gone. I felt hollow. I couldn't call her. I couldn't face her. Not now. Maybe not ever. She had taken everything from me, my trust, my faith in our life together, and twisted it into something ugly. Something I couldn't recognize anymore. I turned off the phone and set it down, feeling the silence settle around me. There was no fixing this. There was no closure to be found. Linda had torn apart everything we had, piece by piece, and now there was nothing left but the wreckage. I sat there, staring out at the night, knowing that the life I thought I could rebuild was now further away than ever. The future looked darker, more uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I could never go back.